The autumn wind rattled the shutters of the small villa outside Florence as Niccolò Machiavelli bent over his manuscript by candlelight. The year was 1513, and the former secretary to the Florentine Republic found himself in exile, his political career seemingly ended by the return of the Medici family to power. Yet in this forced solitude, wrestling with the harsh realities that had destroyed his idealistic view of governance, Machiavelli was about to articulate a truth so profound and disturbing that it would echo through the corridors of power for centuries to come. The secret he was preparing to reveal was not merely about the mechanics of political control or the strategic use of deception. It was something far more fundamental and unsettling, the recognition that human nature itself contains an irreducible darkness that makes traditional moral frameworks not just inadequate for effective governance, but actively dangerous to the stability of society. This insight would challenge everything that political philosophy had taught about virtue, justice, and the possibility of good government. As Machiavelli dipped his quill in ink and began to write what would become The Prince, he understood that he was crossing a threshold from which there could be no return. The comfortable illusions that had sustained political thought since ancient times were about to be shattered by a truth too dark for most minds to accept, yet too essential for any serious student of power to ignore. Part 1: The Shattering of Noble Illusions. The journey toward this dark revelation had begun years earlier, during Machiavelli's service in the chaotic political landscape of Renaissance Italy. He had witnessed firsthand the spectacular failures of leaders who governed according to Christian virtue and classical ideals of honor. The Republic of Florence, despite its noble intentions and democratic aspirations, found itself repeatedly humiliated by more ruthless neighbors. Time and again, Machiavelli observed leaders who were personally virtuous, intellectually capable, and genuinely committed to the welfare of their people, yet who presided over catastrophic defeats and political collapse. The pattern was unmistakable, yet its implications were too terrible for most to acknowledge. Traditional political philosophy, from Plato's philosopher kings to Cicero's ideal of virtuous leadership, was built upon a fundamental assumption that moral goodness and political effectiveness were not only compatible but necessarily linked. The just ruler, guided by wisdom and virtue, would naturally create a just and prosperous state. This assumption had become so deeply embedded in Western thought that questioning it seemed tantamount to questioning the very possibility of civilization itself. But Machiavelli's careful observations revealed a different reality. He had studied the career of Cesare Borgia, the notorious son of Pope Alexander VI, whose methods were universally condemned as ruthless and immoral. Yet Borgia had achieved in a few short years what the most virtuous leaders of Italy had failed to accomplish in decades. He had united the fractured territories of the Romagna, eliminated banditry, established efficient administration, and created a stable foundation for lasting peace. His subjects, far from suffering under his tyranny, experienced unprecedented prosperity and security. The contrast was stark and undeniable. While virtuous leaders struggled against the intractable problems of human selfishness, corruption, and conflict, Borgia had cut through these difficulties with surgical precision. He had not appealed to men's better angels or attempted to educate them toward virtue. Instead, he had worked with human nature as he found it, using a combination of calculated violence, strategic deception, and carefully calibrated rewards and punishments to create order from chaos. This observation forced Machiavelli to confront a possibility that struck at the heart of everything he had been taught about governance and morality. What if the traditional virtues were not just inadequate for effective leadership, but actually counterproductive? What if the very qualities that made a person admirable in private life made them dangerous and incompetent in the arena of political power? The more deeply Machiavelli explored this possibility, the more evidence he found to support it. Compassion, which seemed like an unqualified good in personal relationships, could lead a ruler to show mercy to defeated enemies who would later return to threaten the state. Honesty, essential for trust between individuals, could prove disastrous when dealing with foreign powers who had no intention of honoring their own agreements. Generosity, admirable in a private citizen, could bankrupt a treasury and leave a nation vulnerable to its enemies. But the implications went deeper still. Machiavelli began to perceive that the problem was not merely one of inappropriate application of virtues designed for private life to the public sphere. The problem was that human nature itself was fundamentally different from what moral philosophers had assumed. Traditional ethics had been built upon the premise that humans possessed an essential goodness that could be cultivated through education, religious instruction, and proper social arrangements. Even when acknowledging the reality of human sinfulness or imperfection, classical and Christian thinkers had maintained that virtue represented humanity's true nature, while vice was a corruption or deviation from that essential goodness. Machiavelli's observations suggested something far more disturbing, that what moralists called vice was not a deviation from human nature but an expression of it. The selfishness, cruelty, deception, and violence that virtuous leaders constantly struggled against were not aberrations to be corrected but permanent features of the human condition that must be accepted and managed. Men were not basically good beings who occasionally chose evil, they were creatures driven by self-interest who occasionally chose good when it served their purposes or when they were compelled to do so by external forces. This insight revealed why virtuous leadership so often failed catastrophically. Leaders who based their strategies on appeals to human goodness were building on quicksand. When crisis came, when the chips were down, when self-interest and virtue came into conflict, virtue would lose every time. The brutal truth was that most people would choose their own advantage over the common good, their own safety over abstract principles, their own comfort over the suffering of others. A leader who failed to account for this reality was not just naive, he was criminally irresponsible toward those who depended on his protection. The recognition of this truth was profoundly isolating. To see human nature clearly meant abandoning the comfortable fictions that made social life bearable for most people. It meant acknowledging that the noble speeches about honor, justice, and virtue that filled the air at court functions and public ceremonies were largely theater, designed to disguise rather than reveal the true motivations behind political action. It meant understanding that the real business of governance took place in shadows, through calculations that could never be spoken aloud because they would shock and horrify those who preferred their illusions intact. Yet this isolation was the price of effectiveness. A leader who truly understood human nature could work with it rather than against it. Instead of being constantly surprised and disappointed by human selfishness, he could anticipate and channel it toward productive ends. Instead of relying on the fragile reed of human virtue, he could build institutions and incentives that made virtue and self-interest coincide. Most importantly, he could protect his people from the consequences of their own nature by being willing to shoulder the burden of actions that they could not morally approve but that were necessary for their safety and prosperity. This was the first part of Machiavelli's dark secret, the recognition that effective governance required abandoning the moral frameworks that made life meaningful for ordinary people. The leader who would truly serve his people must be prepared to sacrifice not just his life, but his soul, accepting damnation in the service of their earthly welfare. He must become, in the eyes of conventional morality, a monster, precisely in order to prevent genuine monsters from destroying the social order. Part 2, The Necessity of Strategic Darkness. The second part of Machiavelli's insight was even more disturbing than the first. Having recognized that human nature made conventional virtue ineffective in political leadership, he was forced to confront the logical conclusion of this recognition, that effective governance required not merely the suspension of moral constraints, but their deliberate and systematic violation. The prince who would succeed must become fluent in the language of evil, not as a corruption of his role but as its essential requirement. This was not a matter of occasional moral compromise or regrettable but necessary expedients. Machiavelli had discovered that the dark arts of power formed a coherent and sophisticated system of knowledge, as intricate and demanding as any scholarly discipline. Just as a physician must study anatomy and disease in order to heal, the effective prince must study human corruption and weakness in order to govern. And, just as a physician must sometimes cause pain in order to cure, the prince must sometimes commit acts of calculated cruelty in order to preserve the peace. The systematic nature of this requirement became clear as Machiavelli analyzed the specific techniques that successful rulers employed. Take, for instance, the management of threat and violence. Traditional morality taught that violence should be avoided except as a last resort, and, when used, it should be proportionate to the offense and guided by principles of justice. But Machiavelli observed that rulers who followed these principles were systematically outmaneuvered by those who understood violence as a tool of statecraft. Effective violence, he realized, must be sudden, overwhelming, and precisely calculated to create maximum psychological impact with minimum actual bloodshed. A ruler who executed a few carefully chosen conspirators in a public and spectacular manner would prevent far more deaths than one who allowed rebellion to fester through misplaced mercy. Similarly, a prince who responded to border raids with such devastating retaliation that neighboring powers would think twice before testing his resolve would maintain peace far more effectively than one who responded proportionally to each provocation. But, the application of such strategic violence required a kind of moral flexibility that was psychologically demanding in the extreme. The prince must be able to order the execution of men who might be personally likable, even admirable in many respects, if their continued existence threatened the stability of the state. He must be willing to break solemn oaths when honoring them would disadvantage his people, knowing that his word would be considered worthless by those who could not see the larger calculations involved. He must cultivate relationships of apparent friendship with those he knew he might need to destroy, maintaining perfect emotional control while planning their downfall. The deceptive arts presented an even more complex challenge. Unlike violence, which was at least honest in its brutality, deception required the prince to live in a world where truth itself became subordinated to strategic necessity. This went far beyond the obvious requirements of diplomatic duplicity or military misdirection. The effective prince must become a master of what Machiavelli termed magnificent deception, the ability to craft and maintain false narratives so compelling that they became more powerful than actual facts. Consider the management of public opinion, which Machiavelli recognized as crucial to political stability long before modern theories of propaganda were developed. The prince must present himself to his subjects as the embodiment of their highest values, while simultaneously pursuing policies that might contradict those values entirely. He must appear religious while manipulating religious authorities, seem generous while carefully hoarding resources, project strength while concealing weaknesses, and demonstrate compassion while preparing harsh measures. This required not just tactical lying, but the development of what might be called a dual consciousness. The prince must internalize the noble persona he projected while maintaining cold awareness of its fabricated nature. He must be capable of genuine emotion when the situation called for it, yet able to manufacture false emotion when genuine feeling would be counterproductive. Most demanding of all, he must never allow his subjects to perceive the calculation behind his apparent spontaneity, lest they lose the essential faith that made their obedience possible. The psychological toll of maintaining such deception was enormous. The prince lived in a state of perpetual isolation, unable to form genuine relationships with those around him because every interaction was potentially compromised by political necessity. He could never be certain whether others' expressions of loyalty or affection were genuine or merely reflections of his power. Even his own emotions became suspect, as the habits of deception gradually eroded his ability to distinguish between authentic and performed feeling. Yet this isolation was not merely a regrettable side effect of political necessity, it was itself a source of strategic advantage. The prince who remained emotionally detached from those around him could make decisions based on cold calculation rather than personal feeling. He could sacrifice allies when necessary, exploit enemies when advantageous, and shift alliances based on changing circumstances without being paralyzed by sentiment or loyalty. His very inhumanity became a form of superhuman effectiveness. The third element of strategic darkness involved the manipulation of hope and fear, which Machiavelli recognized as the fundamental forces governing human behavior. Traditional morality suggested that good leadership involved inspiring hope while minimizing fear, creating conditions where people could flourish through their own efforts and choices. But Machiavelli observed that unrealistic hope was actually destabilizing, encouraging people to take risks that endangered themselves and others, while appropriate fear channeled behavior towards socially beneficial ends. The skilled prince learned to calibrate these emotions with scientific precision. He created fear of specific consequences for antisocial behavior while maintaining hope for rewards contingent on cooperation. He encouraged fear of external enemies while projecting confidence in his ability to protect his subjects. Most subtly, he learned to make his subjects fear the possibility of his absence more than they resented his presence, creating a dependence that felt voluntary while being carefully engineered. This emotional manipulation required the prince to study his subjects with the detached curiosity of a natural philosopher examining specimens. He must understand their particular anxieties, desires, prejudices, and weaknesses, not in order to address them with compassion, but to exploit them for political advantage. He must learn to recognize the signs of brewing discontent before they became visible to others, to identify natural leaders who might become rivals, to spot the ambitious individuals who could be turned into useful tools or dangerous enemies. The cumulative effect of mastering these dark arts was the transformation of the prince into something that transcended ordinary human categories. He became a creature of pure will, unencumbered by the emotional and moral constraints that limited other men. Yet this transformation came at a cost that extended beyond personal psychological damage. The prince who mastered strategic darkness risked losing touch with the very humanity he sought to protect and govern. This was the second part of Machiavelli's dark secret, that effective power required not just the abandonment of conventional morality, but the systematic cultivation of its opposite. The prince must become expert in precisely those arts that society condemned, not as a tragic necessity but as a professional requirement. He must develop virtues that were indistinguishable from vices, skills that were morally indistinguishable from crimes, and insights that were psychologically indistinguishable from corruption. Part 3, The Terrible Wisdom of Power. The final and most disturbing element of Machiavelli's insight concerned the ultimate implications of strategic darkness for the nature of political society itself. Having recognized that effective governance required the systematic violation of moral norms, and that such violation must be elevated to the level of professional expertise, he was forced to confront a question that struck at the foundation of civilization: what did this say about the value and meaning of the moral order that politics was ostensibly designed to protect? This question led Machiavelli into the deepest and most dangerous territory of his analysis. He began to perceive that the relationship between power and morality was not merely one of tragic tension or necessary compromise, but of fundamental contradiction. The moral order that gave meaning and structure to ordinary life was not just irrelevant to the exercise of power, it was actively hostile to it. Conversely, the knowledge and skills required for effective governance were not just morally neutral tools, but forces that corroded and undermined the very values they were meant to serve. The implications of this recognition were staggering. If politics required the systematic violation of moral norms, then political society was built upon a lie. The noble rhetoric of justice, virtue, and the common good that justified governmental authority was revealed as elaborate camouflage for a system based on manipulation, violence, and exploitation. The laws that citizens were expected to obey, the taxes they were required to pay, the military service they were compelled to perform, all rested ultimately not on moral obligation but on the skillful application of strategic darkness by those in power. But the analysis went deeper still. Machiavelli realized that this deception was not an unfortunate necessity that might someday be overcome through enlightenment or reform. It was a permanent structural requirement of political society. The ordinary citizens whose welfare the prince sought to protect were psychologically incapable of accepting the truth about the methods used in their protection. Their ability to live meaningful lives depended upon maintaining faith in moral principles that political action systematically violated. To reveal the truth would not create a more honest and just society, it would destroy the foundations of social cooperation entirely. This created what might be called the paradox of political knowledge. The insights that made effective governance possible were precisely those that could never be shared with the governed. The prince who truly served his people must lie to them not only about his specific actions, but about the entire nature of political reality. He must allow them to believe in a moral universe that he knew to be illusory, while basing his decisions on an understanding of human nature that they could not psychologically accept. The burden of this knowledge was almost unbearable. The prince who fully grasped Machiavelli's insight found himself in a position of cosmic loneliness, cut off from the moral community whose existence made life meaningful for others. He could not seek comfort in religion, because he understood too well how religious authority was manipulated for political ends. He could not find solace in friendship, because all relationships were potentially compromised by political calculation. He could not even take pride in his accomplishments, because the methods by which they were achieved violated everything he had been taught to value. Yet this isolation was the price of a terrible form of wisdom. The prince who accepted the full implications of strategic darkness gained access to truths about human nature and social organization that were hidden from others. He could see through the elaborate pretenses that govern social interaction, understand the real motivations behind apparently noble actions, and predict with uncanny accuracy how people would behave when their true interests were at stake. This knowledge revealed patterns that were invisible to those who remained within the framework of conventional morality. The prince could observe how religious enthusiasm could be channeled into political support, how economic anxiety could be transformed into military aggression, how cultural pride could be manipulated to justify territorial expansion. He could recognize the signs of impending social breakdown before they became apparent to others, anticipate the emergence of new forms of political organization, and adapt his strategies to changing circumstances with a flexibility that seemed almost supernatural to his contemporaries. But, perhaps most significantly, the prince who mastered Machiavelli's insights gained the ability to create and destroy the very moral frameworks that others took for granted. He could understand how systems of value were constructed and maintained, how they could be modified to serve political purposes, and how they could be replaced when they ceased to be useful. This was perhaps the most godlike of all political powers, the ability to shape not just behavior, but the beliefs and values that made behavior meaningful. The exercise of such power required a form of moral courage that transcended ordinary categories. The prince must be willing not only to sacrifice his own moral standing, but to take responsibility for the moral order of society as a whole. He must decide which values to preserve, which to modify, and which to abandon, knowing that these decisions would affect the spiritual lives of countless individuals who would never understand the basis on which they were made. He must be prepared to be remembered as a tyrant by those whose freedom he preserved, as a deceiver by those whose trust he protected, as a monster by those whose humanity he defended. This was the ultimate test of political greatness, the willingness to accept damnation in the service of others' salvation. The truly great prince would be misunderstood not just by his enemies, but by his beneficiaries. His true achievements could never be acknowledged, because acknowledging them would require revealing the methods by which they were accomplished. He would live and die in a solitude that no ordinary person could comprehend, sustained only by the knowledge that his sacrifices had made possible the continued existence of a moral order that condemned him. The final irony of Machiavelli's insight was that it revealed moral heroism in what appeared to be its opposite. The prince who embraced strategic darkness did not do so for personal advantage or from lack of moral sensitivity, but from a deeper understanding of what morality actually required. He recognized that preserving the conditions under which ordinary virtue could flourish required someone to venture into territories where virtue could not survive. He accepted the burden of moral impossibility so that others could maintain their moral innocence. This recognition transformed the very meaning of political action. Politics was revealed not as applied ethics, but as the art of transcending ethics in the service of ethical goals. The prince who truly understood his role became a kind of sacrificial figure, accepting spiritual corruption so that spiritual purity could continue to exist in the world. His apparent cynicism was revealed as the deepest form of idealism, his seeming immorality as the highest form of moral commitment. Yet even this noble interpretation could not entirely resolve the fundamental contradiction at the heart of political existence. The prince who sacrificed his soul for others' benefit remained spiritually damned by any conventional measure. The moral order he preserved through immoral means remained ultimately founded on deception and violence. The society he protected remained structured around fundamental inequalities of knowledge and power that made genuine moral community impossible. Machiavelli's final insight was perhaps the darkest of all, that these contradictions were not problems to be solved but conditions to be accepted. The human condition itself was characterized by moral impossibility. The very capacity for good that made humans worthy of protection also made them incapable of protecting themselves. The desire for meaning that made life valuable also made truth unbearable. The social cooperation that enabled civilization also required the systematic violation of the principles that made cooperation seem worthwhile. As Machiavelli finished writing in his villa outside Florence, he understood that he had articulated something that could never be unsaid. The knowledge he had uncovered would spread, gradually and inevitably, through the corridors of power. Future princes would read his words and recognize truths they had sensed but never dared to acknowledge. The comfortable illusions that had sustained political thought for centuries would slowly crumble, replaced by a harder but more effective understanding of what governance actually required. Yet he also knew that the majority of people would always reject these insights, not because they were false, but because they were unbearable. The dark secret he had revealed would remain secret not through censorship or suppression, but through the psychological impossibility of facing what it implied about the nature of human society. Most would continue to believe in the possibility of moral politics, virtuous leadership, and just government, not because these beliefs were supported by evidence, but because the alternatives were too terrible to contemplate. And, perhaps, Machiavelli reflected, this was as it should be. The preservation of these necessary illusions was itself a political good, one that required the existence of those few individuals willing and able to act on the basis of darker truths. The secret would remain secret because keeping it secret was itself part of the wisdom it contained. In the end, the greatest achievement of strategic darkness might be its ability to preserve the light of moral hope, even if that light illuminated a world that existed only in the imagination of those too innocent to see clearly. The candle burned low as Machiavelli set down his pen, knowing that he had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. He had seen too much to ever again find comfort in the moral certainties that sustained others, yet too little to ever find peace in the knowledge he had gained. He would remain forever suspended between the world of political necessity and the world of human meaning, serving as a bridge between realms that could never be reconciled. This too was part of the terrible wisdom of power, the recognition that some truths could only be borne by those strong enough to live with their implications, yet caring enough to protect others from having to face them. In the dying light of that autumn evening, Machiavelli understood that he had discovered not just a secret about politics, but a secret about the human condition itself. We are creatures caught between our need for meaning and our incapacity for truth, between our desire for goodness and our requirement for survival, between our longing for community and our fundamental isolation. Politics was simply the arena where these contradictions were played out on the largest scale, where the costs of human nature's impossible demands were paid by those willing to sacrifice everything, including their own souls, to preserve the possibility that others might believe in something better than the truth.